sociologist of gender, and she's also a professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Study here at Westchester. She has long experience in study and teaching related to the sociology of gender as it relates to the experiences of women of color, college students, nursing, and in particular, some rather sensitive subjects, such as, the very important ones of human trafficking, intimate violence, and immigration. Recently, she's been studying she's been performing ethnographic research on the experiences of women of color college students to explain their success in college and the obstacles they face as well. So we're really happy to have Lisa speak to us today. Please.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Hey, everyone in Zoom and also here in the room. If I need to slow down or repeat, please just jump in and ask me to do that. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. I am a sociologist and professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. And I want to thank you all for coming to this talk. A central practice for us in women's and gender studies is to situate our research and our writing in our identities and to consistently interrogate the relationship between identity and research. One way to do this is to claim those and to consider how these perspectives inform the knowledge we produce. So following this tradition, I will begin by locating myself in the research. I'm a teacher, I'm a scholar, an activist, a wife, and a mom. My pronouns are she, her. My identities are white, cisgender, lesbian, and woman. Critical race feminism and intersectionality have been the foundation of my work for over 30 years. But that doesn't make me an expert or what sociologist Dr. Patricia Hill Collins would call an insider. As a white woman, I join other white anti-racist people, especially those of us who use intersectionality in being clear, careful, and thoughtful about how we do this work. Throughout the study, my team of student assistants and I considered how our identities shape our research design, data collection, and analysis. We did not take our identities for granted. I did not, especially as a white woman professor, in this intellectual pursuit. So my whiteness likely afforded me privilege in what Jonathan Warren calls an imagined superiority of whiteness. But at the same time, and although race matching does not guarantee trust, our participants had every reason to not trust me or the research. They did, however, have every reason to trust my team, which consisted of 4 students over 3 years, 3 of whom identified as women of color. We were a team in every sense of the word. As I trained them, they trained each other, and they contributed to the entire research project from design through data collection, analysis, and initial drafting of findings. As a white woman, it is important that I'm clear that not only do I practice intersectionality, but I do so with a clear indication of its intellectual roots in critical race feminism. So in other words, intersectionality is widely used by a large number of disciplines. I'm locating my use in its roots. This makes no mistake then about the undergirding from which I draw. I use intersectionality to help interpret the experiences of women of color, but I do not and could not speak for or on behalf of women of color. Intersectionality is a theoretical approach, one of many developed by women of color feminists, but I don't use it for this reason. Instead, I followed Jonathan Nash, a Black woman feminist scholar, and Kathy Davis, a white woman feminist scholar, who both expanded the potential of intersectionality and Black feminist thought while being accountable to their own standpoint perspectives. As such, they respect the race-gendered bodies of the mostly women of color who produce Black feminist thought, but also call for the sharing of this and the travels of this theory. So as a white woman scholar who has learned about, studied, and applied intersectionality for 30 years, I don't adopt intersectionality lightly, or simply because it's claimed as foundational to women's and gender studies. I do not have an allegiance with it per se, but rather I have observed over time as a sociologist and as a feminist, how it produces knowledge from experiences that are invisible but critically important to social and political practice. Many predominantly white institutions have a long commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. These commitments are sometimes symbolic in nature and sometimes structurally based. They can be traced over time and also emphasized during times of social turmoil and unrest. How PWIs, predominantly white institutions, aspire to attain diversity is one of the diversity dilemmas outlined in this project. Under the worst conditions, diversity is part of a neoliberal marketing strategy to gain capital. Under the best conditions, however, blind spots about diversity are unintentional and invisible via assumed whiteness and other identities of privilege. Often, institutions will be characterized by both at the same time. Neoliberal practices, which are exploitative, and well-meaning intentions that aim to accomplish equity. In this project, we try to learn from the inevitable failures of even the most well-meaning of institutions. So 2 days ago, you all probably noticed WCU launched its new rebrand. Part of this is a redesigned website that includes video and pictures of people throughout campus. Almost immediately, people commented on the overabundance of people of color on the site. So much so that it seemed to misrepresent our status as a PWI. These observations are not wrong, and in fact have been made for quite some time throughout higher education. So not just here, throughout higher education. When we asked our women of color students why they chose a PWI instead of an HBCU, many claimed they were excited about a university that promised diversity and inclusion. However, when they got there, they felt deceived and alone. Here are a sampling of quotes that help illustrate this theme. And these are just the words: the claim to be diverse is frustrating because it is not diverse. They have multicultural organizations.
Are these Westchester quotes or
These are
large?
These are from our research participants, which in a few slides, I'll talk about my method. So these quotes are a way to introduce the project, but they are actual quotes from the research participants. They have multicultural organizations, but all those organizations don't really get funding at all. So to keep it going, it's kind of like their own passion than coming here and doing tourism stuff, statues in the middle of campus. And it's like, wow, this school is actually big on diversity and making people feel included, but it's kind of like a token. Some of this we can't see as well, and I'm actually reading directly from my slides, but this is a quote that says how the website makes an effort to highlight people of color, but when you get here, there isn't a lot of faculty and staff of color. The website lied because it is totally different from what I saw.
Yeah, you can drag that over.
Like that. Should I cross it down?
Click on that little line.
To minimize it, okay. All right, they had it on the front page. We are building up equity, something else in diversity. I laughed so hard, diversity where? So how do we explain how a well-meaning, well-intentioned university could completely miss the mark? We begin with the theoretical foundations. The first is intersectionality, as I've already discussed. It's developed by critical race feminists. It offers multifaceted explanations for our experience, helps us to understand oppression, privilege, and resistance, is a lens that frames and informs research and practice. Here we see how critical race feminism is not a new trend, but rather a long trajectory in the university, in feminism, and in other liberation movements, in social media, which of course is strengthened by a long history of activism. Although currently framed in social and popular media as a correction to white feminism, and they're not wrong. I encourage us, though, to move critical race feminism from margins to center, as renowned scholar Bell Hooks called us to do many years ago. Kimberly Crenshaw herself has made it very clear that although she coined the term, she did so on the strength of critical race and critical race feminists who preceded her. As a women's and gender studies scholar and teacher, it is my view that critical race feminism is the foundation and should be the best practice in our work. I combine the tradition of critical race feminism with critiques of neoliberalism in higher education to help make clear a very important blind spot, what renowned feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed calls the permanence of whiteness. Ahmed explains how even the most well-meaning PWIs don't see the negative outcomes of diversity initiatives because of this permanence of whiteness. The permanence of whiteness is a social condition that's rooted in white supremacy and manifested, though, in mundane, everyday interactions, even those that aim for inclusion. These circumstances are usually assumed for and administered by white people and then solidified as universally applied across the institution. People of color, of course, notice these practices as exclusionary to them, but as is the case with all social privilege, this exclusion is invisible often to us as white people, especially those of us who are in power. For example, when a group of women of color students created programming specifically for them, and when a white woman student complained about not being allowed to access that group, administrators fought the initiative by stating that any student programming for women should include all women, regardless of race. Faculty, students, and staff challenged this decision made by administration, which resulted in a reversal of decision and support for programming just for women of color. At the same time, that was good news, but at the same time, how this turn of events required extra effort on behalf of women of color students is evidence for how PWIs norm inclusion as inclusion for all, which ultimately privileges the already privileged. The permanence of whiteness is exacerbated by what critical race feminist Amber Jamila Musser calls the commodification of minority bodies. In my first book, I used the concept of emotional labor to help explain how bodies become commodified in nursing and to show how bedside care work is professional expertise. In this current project, we draw on the work of Musser and how she used emotional labor to explain the work demands of faculty of color in higher education and how it is employed in the classroom, student affairs, and administrative leadership. We follow Musser to consider how women of color students are expending emotional labor in ways that support diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, but do so at their expense. So how do institutions of higher education know they've achieved diversity, equity, and inclusion? One strategy is to conduct studies to help improve retention and graduation rates for what we call underrepresented minority students. Studies like these typically categorize students by only one race, African American, Latinx, or Native American. And as is the case with most studies like this study that you see showed that while many URM, underrepresented minority students, needed support overall, women of color students were succeeding because they had high GPAs, high graduation rates, and high retention rates. That's good news. But the implications for those results also meant that for women of color students, they were celebrated as a success, but did not require additional support. Findings like these are in sharp contrast to the lived experiences of women of color undergraduates, faculty and staff in academia. One of my former students, Stephanie, serves as a great example. So this is just a story. One day, Stephanie came into my office and asked if we could talk. I smiled and I told her to come in and gestured towards the seat in front of my desk. She sat down, looked nervous and unsure, and began to explain her frustrations and concerns. She explained how she chose our university because we seemed so diverse, but now she was regretting her decision. Even though she had strategies to cope, it was exhausting to be one of only a couple of women of color in her classes, often the only Black woman, especially when conversations would turn to race. She told me that most times she would stay quiet and just listen, observe, and take notes. But sometimes she would feel compelled to speak because she wasn't confident that the professor, especially if they were white, would correct the white peers, her white peers. She knew she was doing well on paper, but she felt alone because she could not relate to many of her peers or her professors. She looked for other women of color, but saw few students, fewer staff members, and even fewer professors who looked like her. She didn't understand the sea of whiteness, especially given how hard she worked. She couldn't be the only one, but she consistently felt isolated and as if she did not belong. She was confused about these feelings, which were exacerbated in part because she had no one to talk to. She struggled, but she still tried to figure out how to fix these issues. Soon, however, she would feel overwhelmed, so she would stop thinking about it and just try to push through. But even this caused her some distress because she felt guilty for not standing up for her communities. We talked for a long time, which she thanked me for at the end. When she finished, she smiled at me and said it was good to vent. I was glad she had that momentary relief, but I knew it wasn't enough. Over time, I heard other stories like Stephanie's. We all considered then the sharp contrast of their experiences against the equity report findings and created a program titled We Squared Women's Education and Empowerment. This was a one-year community building and mentorship program for only women of color that matched college students with high school mentees, and the college students then had mentors that were faculty and staff. After the program ended, everybody wanted it to continue. And one thing we knew for sure is that we needed more information. So later, I secured the first of several grants and hired my first team of student research assistants. And what follows now are some notes about our design. So our research question for the following 2 years was, what invisible barriers do women of color face while thriving on a campus that excludes them? The method is an ethnographic case study of one regional state-funded public university over 3 years, informed by the theories I've already mentioned. It included participant observation of campus events, in-depth semi-structured interviews with women of color undergraduate students, content analysis of university promotion and recruitment materials. And then we conducted inductive thematic analysis, which included systematic coding of all of our notes, files, transcriptions, and content images. And the themes that I'll be discussing next were triangulated from these 3 sources of data collection. Our observations, combined with our in-depth interviews, revealed how women of color undergraduates felt when they were positioned to be a bridge of communication and education to further institutional diversity initiatives and goals, to prevent stereotypes, and to improve campus climate. And here are some of the quotes. This bridge manifested several ways and in various contexts: in the classroom, in student organizations, in university promotion efforts, with white peers, with and on behalf of men of color peers, and for faculty, staff, and administrators. There's a historical legacy to carrying this burden, as made clear by the body of scholarship by Black and women of color feminist theorists. And this book is obviously the metaphor from which we're drawing from. That was published decades ago, but it gives us this idea of bridge, like what it needs to be a bridge in between different racialized communities to hopefully bolster equity, but then how that burden is unfairly put on the bodies and the work of, in this case, women of color students. So students felt a range of feelings about how they taught white people on campus, but in all cases, they knew they had to balance their own emotional responses against the potential emotions of the dominant group. So this balance of emotions that I talk about in the book manuscript is part of what I mean by emotional labor. It's a constant mitigation of emotions that other people don't have to do. The second theme I want to talk about today is what my research assistant coined the daily normal. Our analysis of observations at campus events, in social media, and in-depth interviews revealed how women of color undergraduates experienced racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia as explained and interpreted by them. These could be analyzed as microaggressions, but as I said, one of my research assistants, Krista Rivers, coined the term the daily normal to capture how women of color undergraduates consistently mitigate offenses that are simultaneously mundane, extreme, and normalized. These include patterns of being doubted by faculty and staff as appropriate college students and being dismissed by their peers as real, quote unquote, about their identities. Women of color also mitigated experiences of disrespect from peers, faculty, and staff who asked invasive, inappropriate questions and violated their personal and bodily space. The big quote on the screen is an example of that. Again, a larger theme, though, that was salient in the data. Women of color experienced dehumanizing incidents of harassment and other forms of violence in social media, on campus, and in town. We analyzed all of these from an intersectional lens to help explain and contextualize specific harmful acts so that these perhaps could be more visible in diversity, discourse, and remedies. To better understand success through struggle, we asked participants to explain their strategies and what they would tell a younger version of self. So a big part of this project was to talk about the obstacles faced, but also to be clear about the strength and resilience that these students were demonstrating on a daily basis. These portions of interviews revealed the power, agency, and resistance of women of color undergraduates in ways that demonstrate how they successfully navigated college, not just that they did. They detailed specific strategies, like some of the ones you're seeing here. They also talked about advice that they would offer to younger women of color. And they offered suggestions for institutional and policy change. Again, we analyzed all of these within the rich tradition of Black feminist scholarship that aims to highlight the struggles, but also the survivals, and then the knowledge that we gleaned from identity-based experience. As a result of this study, my team and the research participants made several important recommendations for DEI initiatives. Again, these are thematic in nature and come directly from the data. These include, I apologize for the font, I'll read these. Reinstate a cascade mentorship program just for women of color. It should be led by a woman of color. Match mentoring programs by race and gender and keep these pairs small. Provide safe zones, programs that are specific and available only for women of color. Require white students to learn anti-racism. Create initiatives to hire and retain women of color, faculty, staff, and counselors. And then most important, avoid claiming success. DEI programs should be ongoing and consistent. So what have we learned? First, it is critically important that we continue to do what renowned sociologist Kathleen Blee teaches us, that in order to understand and fix a problem, we must study the mundane. In this case, studying and redefining the meaning of successful student, like what that actually means, makes our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts better, but it also supports our students. Theoretically, I hope the synthesis of intersectionality, critiques of neoliberal diversity initiatives, and emotional labor will be applied in other studies of inequality in higher education and elsewhere. I also hope this project will serve to model how the intersectional approach can be used to study higher education. Practically, I hope this project will serve as a guide to higher education professionals and anyone else interested in complicating diversity narratives and strengthening diversity initiatives. We should all consider these perspectives, take up these recommendations, and honor the experience and knowledge offered by these amazing students. And yep. And that's what I have. So I'm looking forward to any questions, any comments.
A very basic question.
Okay.
Could you define intersectionality?
Sure. So intersectionality is decades-long tradition of theory and praxis. So it comes from the actual experiences of people, but it's applied to a wide range of intellectual pursuits and social activism. And what it does, which is what you're asking, is it lets us examine life at the merging of more than one identity. So instead of explaining education just from the perspective of race, how does race impact education? Intersectionality offers us a research approach to look at race and gender simultaneously, not as an additive analysis, but literally at the same time.
I'm wondering how much dissatisfaction that students have with the institution is, how much of the claims to have already been successful in diversity really comes into the mix with their experience here of alienation.
Oh, so it's sort of I think what you're asking, Walt, is the relationship between that we're good, that we're diverse, that we've succeeded, we've made it, and then how that might negatively impact psychologically even. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but psychologically impact the students who then are experiencing very different,
on top of everything else.
Different world on top of every, again, it would be really awesome to partner with a psychologist to think about that cognitive dissonance. That would be another way to explain what I saw, which was, stress and discontent and worry and, but then again, resilience and, I'm gonna push through. So yeah, my guess is that, that my answer is yes, absolutely. There's a relationship. And I think there's probably several different ways to explain it.
There's a real, part of that is real expectation setting, isn't it? The institution has to recognize as well, diversity is a priority, not an accomplishment.
Right.
It is that process, as you were saying at the end. And so that should be part of the message as well. This is something we're working on, not something we've accomplished.
Right, and not just the message, right? So then couple that message, and this is what we hear from critical race scholars and activists consistently, is coupling that message then with structural change and real action. So not just the letters and the emails that we see circulated all through higher ed, right? I mean, just look at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Coupling that though with like actual action. And there's so many cases in this, I mean, this data set, as you can imagine, is huge. And there's so many cases where the university could have thought about supporting programs and projects a little differently, rather than taking that kind of inclusion for all, no matter what approach. I mean, sometimes we do have to think about, social inequalities and who benefits and who loses at what point. So, and then who requires, what additional supports. Yeah.
I wonder if it comes down to an issue of just being transparent in terms of, because it's easy to kind of put it out there, make it seem, yes, this is the thing value, but are we there yet? The answer would be a resounding no. And so it's just taking ownership over that and being transparent about these are the things that we value. We obviously have gotten there rather than again, celebrating these, what seem to be small moments. And, and just kind of taking ownership over that concept of, yeah, these are the things that we'd like to do as an institution, but obviously we have a lot more.
Yeah, intuitively, I will say that I imagine that would feel refreshing. But it's absolutely something I would want to check back with my research participants, right? Because I'm prioritizing those experiences and those knowledge sets. But yeah, I do think that at least what Sarah Ahmed is recommending, in terms of how we handle diversity in higher education, is to consider it, as you already said, Kurt, but this sort of ongoing project. There's limitations. We're working on it. I worry that the working on it sentiment, though, might be then interpreted or stated as almost an excuse. And so that would have to be avoided, right? And of course, I'm just talking off the cuff right now. But yeah, I do think you're right. I think transparency it's actually an important social justice praxis, for sure.
At least there's some acknowledgement.
Right.
It's a step in the way of people not feeling maybe as marginalized.
At least heard.
Yeah, it's some kind of acknowledgement, I guess.
Right.
Would be helpful. There's a multifaceted thing.
Yeah, or some kind of balance, right? So certainly celebrate the successes and celebrate, the accomplishments, but also balance that with, these are our efforts moving forward. This is, these are ways that we're going to keep listening to you, and we're certainly in my, in terms of this talk as a small part of a larger project, my recommendation would be just to consistently say that we're listening and we're working towards change and we're going to keep listening. We're not going to just look at GPAs as indicators of success. It's one indicator for sure, but it should not be the only indicator.
I guess the other question I would have is there avenues, are there established avenues already where those conversations can come, where people feel like they can, aside from like coming into your office at an hour, does that make sense? Like on an institutional level, have the infrastructure to allow for it on a consistent basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should continue to support those offices and departments that are facilitating those spaces, right? So of course, what immediately comes to mind for me is the Center for Women and Gender Equity, which means, let's make sure that that department has the resources it needs to do that work. Other identity-based offices like the Dowdy Center, the Queer and Trans Center, and then certainly, making how the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the university, making, resources to make spaces for that. I think the caution again would be to make sure that there's spaces that are integrated for sure, but also offer spaces where, in the case of race, white people can, talk to other white people about whiteness, where people of color don't have to be burdened with that. And then people of color can talk to other people of color, and to not see those as, a negative thing, to see that as one way to keep those conversations going, for sure. Yeah.
So you have a
No, I just want to make sure, because this isn't showing up here, but there's some chat happening. So I just wanted to make sure. I haven't even looked at it. Oh, thanks everyone. That's so nice. Yeah, Amy asked how we can alter the messaging from WCU to more accurately represent that we are committed to diversity, but we don't want to disappoint prospective students by misleading them. That's the challenge, right? I mean, I think we can talk about commitment and work and efforts in a way that isn't just, we got it, we're done. And then Cindy, who gets to define what counts as an accomplishment, right? Excellent question. And I think that's part of the critical inquiry that we need to engage in. What counts as success? So much of my research and my career, I'm always surprised by something, right? That's That's the fun thing about being a researcher, is that you go in with certain expectations and you walk away with lessons that you never expected. And one of the lessons that I'm coming away with here is also myself rethinking how we define success institutionally.
Asking the target audience whether some of these efforts are successful is probably a good thing to check.
Yeah.
And not just have the administrators say, we have the program to check.
Exactly. And Kurt, look at you coming from a feminist standpoint perspective, right? That's part of women's and gender studies and our theoretical tradition and our research ethics is to talk what we call from the ground up, right? So those people who are closest to whatever issue that we're studying, we want to learn from them. When I did my research with nurses, I was never a nurse. I'm not a nurse, right? So I was constantly like, you are the expert. I'm just trying to understand the conditions of your labor. This is the same kind of thing.
Do you have any other?
I don't think so. I think, yeah, so far so good.
So I had a question. You said you had a very large database. What was the turnout, as it were, of the whole community? How much did you responded? And do you think you caught the most involved, or the mean, or are the people who are most successful here the most representative of the community that actually first enters?
Right, right. So let me try to answer those questions in succession. So first of all, this, as is my research always, should be considered an ethnographic case. So it's not something that we can necessarily generalize unless we can see other ethnographic studies elsewhere. This was not a survey project. So in terms of sample size, and in the tradition of ethnographic qualitative research, my sample size was, it was pretty good. It was over a couple of years' time, and we had, not quite 60 in-depth interviews. Our observation notes were over that time period, hours and hours and hours. Content analysis was not as extensive because we focused it, because we had questions about recruitment and admissions later in the study. All of that to say that, which I think is your last question, about, did we, like, who are we actually talking to? Are these the most successful students? Are they not? Well, the sampling for the interviews was purposeful and it was targeted. So we actually had some interviews where these students weren't necessarily maybe considered successful in the traditional measures. But we also had others, it's a good question. It makes me want to relook at my sample, because we also had other students who were very involved in co-curricular activities, right? And would have something to say about that. And then we had students who were less involved. So without looking closely, my answer would be a mix, but then again, to really consider the limitations there and to not, expect to generalize, which means, of course, that we need to keep investigating. Yeah.
So I was thinking about the dynamic tension between claiming more successes in diversification that actually exist, and that cognitive dissonance with students of color counter that. And
hi there, this is Joan Wolfrey. I've got a problem with Outlook that I won't launch, and I already have the ServiceNow number open. My number is 65494, and my phone number is 0.
Okay, go ahead.
She's just not muted. And then by possible excuse of the problem with having it as an excuse that we're not there yet. And then at the same time, as long as the fact that there are these co-curricular activities that are ethnically based is an indication that we are a predominantly white institution, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when ultimately success is achieved, whatever that looks like, will that be at the time when it's no longer a predominantly white institution? Is that, demographic changes and so on?
I mean, demographic changes make a big difference,
Yeah.
right? And I will say that again, speaking to the data, this is another one of those like, ooh, light bulb moments. I was struck by the theme that emerged over and over again for the need and the want of faculty who looked like us, right? And so that, that showed up in all of it, in the interviews and in the observations, substantially. So yeah, so demographics make a difference. We live in a society, I mean, where it does, right? It impacts our experiences. So given that, certainly if we continue to grow, and I would say in part as we are growing in diversity among people, right, like among bodies, we are changed and we are challenged. It's making sure that this stuff gets filtered up, like all throughout, right, up the chain throughout the institution. Like, and when I say stuff, the messages.
From an admission standpoint, what demographic are you actively recruiting to your institution?
Right.
There's some argument to say, certainly from a financial perspective, it appeared to be colleges were just trying to recruit students.
Well, and I would argue too that it can't just be students, right? Because our students are coming every few years. Like what I would suggest is to do what some of the folks on this campus are already working hard to do, which is figure out how we're going to recruit and retain women of color faculty, women of color staff, right?
Yeah.
People of color faculty and
Seems like
staff
that's the only way to
retain. Yeah.
and shift the institution.
For sure. So, and then also, so then it's not just bodies too. Bodies are important in the ways that we've just talked about, but then how would we integrate institutionally, structures that help support across lines of social inequality and equality? Like, what do we do as an institution? So I would think, especially given the fact that we don't want to continue to put burdens on our students who are already burdened, right? In all the ways, right? It's really incumbent upon us as people who work for this institution to make it part of the institution. So.
I don't even know, are you done with that quarter? It's like a rocket bus. I'm gonna just graphic. Are you done with this?
This?
Yeah.
I think so.
I just don't.
Oh, you know what? I'm not sure because I don't think it matters here. No.
Okay.
Do you need this cord?
I'm just gonna put it away because I have a problem.
Right.
We can put
Actually, we are getting
close to time.
close
Okay.
to time.
All right.
So,
Do you want to come and talk to the Zoom? Yeah.
Right. So I just want to thank Lisa for a really, it's wonderful to hear a talk that generates so many ideas. So I just want everyone to thank Lisa again, and thank you all for joining us for our seminar today, and we hope to see you next week.
Yay. Thank you all for coming.
I know that some people have to run. If there's anybody else who has a question on chat, if we have a few more minutes, we can. If not, thank you and see you again shortly.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah.